do organisations address this? It's a big thing for them to do, isn't it?
It is. Let's think back to 20 years ago. Yeah. You wouldn't have thought about your bank or your energy company really spending that much time on providing anything but an essential service. You think, I go to the bank teller. Maybe I know them. That's when branches maybe were there in more abundance. But you didn't really think about the role of essential services in addressing these. But what we've seen in the last decade, particularly within financial services, and I've written about this as like the vulnerability decade, is we've seen a real response to the 2008 economic crash. So think back to 2008. Gordon Brown's going to save the world. Remember that misquote, that misspeak from Gordon Brown. What happened was the government at the time identified that the regulator of the financial services market, the FSA, didn't really have the teeth it needed. And we had the bonfire of the Quangos. That's very topical. It seems to be happening again. It's where the FSA was tossed on there by the coalition government, who came in after Labour, and we had the Financial Conduct Authority set up. What was really interesting is one of their first tasks was around consumer vulnerability. And it was a term that had floated around a little bit, which sort of maybe in energy, but they've really grasped it. So over that 10-year period, and people listening may not have noticed this happening, there has been an enormous amount of activity, not enough because there's still lots of failings, an enormous amount of activity to get people, get firms to ask that question, vulnerable to what? When we think about opening an account, taking out a credit card, getting a mortgage, falling into debt, experiencing the cost of living, how do we identify those vulnerabilities to harm? And what do we have to do? And it introduces a really, really interesting conundrum for those who work in this space. And it is, hang on a second, we're starting to get commercial organisations providing support in areas that we might traditionally have associated with charities, third sector, or the welfare state. And I think we're seeing something really interesting happening at the moment, all because we have this notion of vulnerability.
Yes. And have the general public, in your experience, I suppose, viewed that as a positive? And that can sound like a stupid question, but you almost alluded to at the beginning that essential services, you wouldn't expect your bank to be talking about vulnerability back in 2005, but they are now. Mm. Some people's view could be, well, why are you getting involved in this area of mental illness, neuropsychological conditions, which financial people and economists are certainly not educated in? Why are they getting involved with it? And has the response from the general public, I guess, been positive or a little dubious about their reasoning behind doing it?
Well, let's start with the economists and the dismal science. So the notion of the rational consumer was at the heart of economic thinking. That's changed with behavioural science. And I think that's also bled into this conception that we do things which perhaps aren't always rational, don't always make sense on the face of it. But what we've seen there is a recognition that financial services are dealing with consumers for all parts of their life. So this isn't just about the transaction happening. This is recognizing the kind of the journey or the pathway that people have gone across. Now, life events would be the one in which maybe we might associate in the past financial services with getting married, having a baby, maybe taking out a loan for a car because you need a bigger car, maybe moving home, or kind of those kind of things. But what we've seen come into the equation is there's a greater presentation and perhaps a great openness within society around some of the things that we might have previously held quiet or silent. And that happens in two ways. It happens both in the public sphere, but the thing is, the public also work for these organisations.
Yeah.
So there's an apocryphal story about the FCA. I think it's a good one. FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority, and when they started out on this work around sort of vulnerability, I was told that some of the senior leaders there saw some consumer letters which detailed circumstances that hadn't really been in the purview or the responsibility of a regulator. And that really moved them to take action. I've heard similar things when chief executives of building societies or banks have been taken to the treatment ward, the cancer centre, and came away and thought, hang on a second, we need to set up a specialist team here. So behind the scenes, our experiences of being human and recognizing the vulnerability in ourselves, our families and others has also played into this regulatory path. But to answer your question about the public, vulnerability is very much a backstage term. You might occasionally, as a consumer, someone might slip on a contact center telephone call and say, I'll put you through to our vulnerability team. But what you're more likely to hear has said is extra help or reasonable adjustments or further support. And so there's a greater thinking here, and this ties into some of the thinking around personalization. So again, these commercial streams that are overlapping with this concept of vulnerability, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Personalization of banking, financial services has actually occurred at the same time as we're starting to think about, okay, how can we smooth out some of the bumps in people's lives? How can we predict them? How can we prevent them? How can we respond to them?
And have they taken that on with good nature? And I know you've worked with the financial services sector, the energy sector, and a lot of the public services. Is it that it's been regulated over the last 10 to 15 years, and increased regulation has meant that they had to act, or do they want to act, in your view?
So I think I'm quite a fan of regulation. Without good regulation, we have things like planes falling out of the sky, or toxins in our food. So I think some element of regulation, perhaps regardless of this wider debate that's happening at the moment about the balance between economic growth and regulation.
Yes, I remember I was talking to Professor Ian Walker about cycling and about nudge, and he was saying, we only tend to nudge the things we don't actually care about. Everything else is regulated.
That's an interesting conception. But there has been a pressure on financial services. Now, he doesn't quote me very much, but I'm going to quote him, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And to kind of paraphrase his quote, it's we live at a time of great inequality, but good societies need good banks. And when he said this in the debate about the global economic crash. He said it back in 2013. I thought, oh, that's a strange conception. Good societies need good banks. But I think there's increasingly a recognition that these commercial activities don't operate in silos. They are, because they are called essential services, part of our everyday lives. And let's think about it. When you're working in one of these organizations, this is actually quite a good mission to work on. You think about, okay, normally what passes along my kind of agenda? It might be kind of the bottom line. It might be profit. It might be diversification of my products. Hang on a second. How can I make our product range more human, a greater recognition of what makes us vulnerable to harm? And then a light bulb might go off. Hang on, it's this thing called the purple pound. I think it's like £273 billion that's associated with the disabled consumer market. There's quite clearly a need to meet third-party requirements. So trusted friends and family when it comes to customers with dementia who are worried about spending. Hang on, there's a space here for innovation and there's a space here for profit. So I think one of the other interesting things on this 10-year journey is we've seen somewhat of a move towards recognizing we're not only doing this because it's the right thing, we're not only doing this because it's a regulatory imperative, but we're also doing this because there's an opportunity here to serve the customer better, but also to kind of, increase the bottom line. And you're recording this podcast, Paul, at a really interesting time because the FCA have just put out a review of the last 3 years of their work on vulnerability. So as ever, Paul, you're very timely, on the button.